Chapter 28 in the first book of Samuel is a horror story, and there are quite a few horror stories in the Bible. And just so that there's no misunderstanding here, I'm talking about horror, horror kind of story. This horror story is a little bit different because it is almost comical. I can't help but just laugh, even though it is absolutely terrifying. There's another thing going on here in these last few chapters of the first book of Samuel. There's a parallel structure, if you will. So in one chapter, we're talking about David and what goes on in his life. In the other chapter, we're talking about King Saul and what goes on in his life. And then we switch back to David and then to Saul and so on and so on. So this is not atypical. In other words, this is fairly typical in the Bible where you have parallel stories. That's especially well pronounced in the book of Judges, where you have Samson on the west, Gideon and Jephthah on the east, and the stories are parallel, so we're not really sure as to what the timing exactly is, and if there's any difference, if there's any time span that we're missing. In other words, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that we see a picture from different points of view, right? So it is pretty phenomenal. And here's how this one goes. And it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said unto David, Know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. And David said to Achish, Surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. And Achish said to David, Therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever. So, just as a reminder from last chapter, that is 27, David is given a town that is called Ziklag, and he is essentially fighting the battles of this Philistine king, right? His name is Achish. And so he's living out there with the Philistines because he's been running from King Saul for a long time now. So one thing that we're not exactly sure at this point is what David's allegiance is. We know that he's not exactly being honest with Achish because David is down fighting these tribes that are definitely not Judean tribes, right? So he's not fighting against, or Israeli tribes for that matter. So he's not fighting against his own people. Yet here we see that he gets invited to fight with Achish against Israel. And we're going to see how that pans out in the next few chapters. But for now, this is kind of left out here in the it's not really understood what his allegiance is. Is he actually going to go fight King Saul? Or is he going to turn and fight against Achish, right? Against that benevolent, what we have here, ruler that lets him have a city so that him, David, and his 600 men can live and do their own thing, as I said last time. Now, you can see from the standpoint of Achish, he's saying, Therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever. So in other words, he's saying that you're going to be with me, we're going to fight our battles together, right? That's what Achish is thinking in his own head. Now, it doesn't necessarily pan out that way because of a ton of stuff that happens, but this is what's going on in his head. We're not exactly sure what goes on in David's head at this point. All right. So this is somewhat related to the following chapters, not as much related to this specific chapter. Okay, so here's how the rest of it goes. Well, here's how the next few verses go. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Okay, so this is somewhat of unfamiliar unfamiliar language here. And I want to clarify a few things of what's going on. So first of all, we're told once again that Samuel was dead. Samuel, of course, if you recall, is the prophet Samuel. He was sort of a guiding light to the kings of Israel, in this case to King Saul, right? God spoke to King Saul through Samuel. Now, he was buried in Ramah. Israel had lamented him, his own city, right? Ramah. And Saul, this is a very interesting point here that is very important for the rest of this chapter. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land, okay? So what is it that someone has a familiar spirits? Those are the types of people that kind of whisper in sessions. They bring up people from the dead, right? Those are what we refer to today as necromancers, right? Those are those types of people, witches. They fall into that type of category. The wizards, on the other hand, and again, you have to remember this is 17th century English. Now we associate the word wizard with something completely different. Wizards back then just meant people who claim to know something secret, right? That's what wizard is. Those are typically, so if you think about it from a contemporary standpoint, let me get my coffee over here, but from a contemporary standpoint, those that are wizards, they typically tend to be men, right? Those are the types that claim to know something, especially about God, that no one else knows. Whereas witches and those with familiar spirits, those that bring up the dead, those necromancers, those that are palm readers, they typically tend to be women, right? If you've noticed that. Either way, whether wizards, witches, or those with familiar spirits, God very explicitly discussed those people in the law of Moses, and he finds them to be an abomination, okay? He finds them to be an abomination. So Saul has gotten rid of those people. What does it say here? And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. So King Saul has gotten rid of those people, once again, because God finds them to be an abomination. Now, why does God find wizards, witches, necromancers, and people that have familiar spirits, those whisperers, why does he find them to be an abomination? He finds them to be an abomination specifically just to address the wizards, because those are not discussed here in this chapter. We'll see what the witches are all about. The wizards are an abomination because there's really nothing secret about God, okay? There's really nothing secret about God. So if you think about it in modern terms, those that we today call cult leaders, those are the wizards, right? They claim to know something that no one else knows about God, right? They claim to know, they have some sort of special knowledge. This goes completely contrary to what God is all about. God wants to reveal himself to us, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the Bible. That's why the Bible is translated in almost any language on earth. That's why it's just literally the open source of open source, right? So if you think about it, it is impossible to hide what is written in the Bible. Now, you can misinterpret it different ways. There's no doubt about that, as we see that happening all the time, but you can't really hide it. And that has been the case forever, okay? That's been the case forever. So just kind of to take you back in history for a little bit, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew to Greek 300 years prior to Christ. So at that point in time, even back then, what we have is a book that is spread widely across societies and is translated in different language. So therefore, it is extraordinarily difficult to alter the content of that book. This is true today, right? If someone tries to, for example, get rid of the electronic versions of the Bible, then there are people like me who have a nice little collection here of 5 or so. The book itself physically is widespread. It's spread also on audio tapes, right? Audio. It's spread online, electronic format. So being a wizard, knowing something, claiming to know something about God that no one else knows, is an abomination to God. That goes contrary to his character, right? So that's how you end up with cults, right? And those cult leaders, those that claim to know something about God that no one else knows, those leaders are typically men, right? And typically those cults are, because we're not really that creative as men, those are typically sex cults, right? Whereas the witches and those with familiar spirits, so-called familiar spirits, those that whisper and just bring people from the dead to talk to them and so on, they're palm readers. The astrologers typically tend to be more men, but the palm readers and those that whisper and bring people, they invoke people from the dead, they just typically happen to be women, and that's the case here, right? So that is the case here. Now what we're told is that King Saul has gotten rid of those people. However, this is what happens next, right? So remember, these people are pitched, the Philistines are pitched for battle on one side, the armies of Israel and King Saul on the other. And when King Saul sees those armies of the Philistines, he is very much afraid, right? So another thing that I want to mention here is that we're told that, and when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams nor by Urim. Urim is this kind of tool that no one knows at this point what exactly that tool looked like, but David used that tool to inquire of God. As I've said before, that kind of sounds a little bit like coin flipping because the answers are either yes or no. So that tool completely disappears after the kings are exiled to Babylon, and even prior to that, after David, we really do not see that tool being used much more, but typically God talks to the kings either through that tool or by prophets, right? What does it say here? Dreams, prophets, Urim, right? So, as we know, and that is explicitly stated in the book of Hebrews, in the old days, those days of the kings, the judges, Abraham, Moses, God talked to people through different means, as it's stated here. This is actually repeated, right? Later on, in the new era, that is since the birth and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? Happy Easter to those who celebrate this weekend. Since then, God talks to people through Christ himself, right? So he does not talk to people through prophets anymore. He talks to people through Christ himself. How is that accomplished? That is accomplished through what we refer to as the Bible, right? Not just the words of Jesus Christ himself. They're typically highlighted and read in the most versions of the New Testament. He speaks to people through this book that is explicitly stated in the book of Hebrews. So there's nothing new here. He just simply at one point stops talking to people through prophets. So whether it's through Jesus Christ and the finished Bible, if you will, the compilation of books, or if it's through prophets, at any given point in society, people have some guidance, right? Back then it was through prophets. Now it's through this book that is finished and widely distributed. So kind of have that in mind. We're all essentially in the same situation regardless of what era we live in, right? What epoch we live in, whether it's 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or now. We're in the same boat. There is nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon says very succinctly. Okay, so here's what happens next. Again, King Saul has gotten rid of all the witches, all of the wizards, familiar spirits. Yet he finds himself in a situation where God does not answer him. We'll find out why God does not answer Saul through any means. So this is first book of Samuel, chapter 28, verses 7 through 10. Then said Saul unto his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at En-Dor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment. And he went, and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up whom I shall name unto thee. And I'm just going to pause here for just a second to explain what's going on, because there's a little bit here, even though it's self-explanatory. He's asking his servants, is there someone here with familiar spirits? I know I got rid of them. So he disguises himself, right? Because he's King Saul. Everyone knows who the king is. He's also a towering man, so one way or another he has to disguise himself. So he puts on other raiment. Raiment means clothing, obviously here. And then he takes 2 men with him, and then they go to En-Dor by night. And he tells the woman, I pray thee, I beg you, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name thee. So he's telling the witch, bring me from the dead the person that I tell you, okay? That's what's going on here. And the woman said unto him, behold, thou knowest what Saul had done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul sware to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord liveth, there shall be no punishment happen to thee for this thing, right? So the witch says, you know that King Saul got rid of those people, got rid of us, and then I'm going to be punished if I do that. So why are you laying a snare for me? So he's saying, why are you trying to trick me into doing this for you whenever you know exactly what the king has done? He's assuring her, right? He swears by the Lord that he's not going to punish that woman. So here's what happens next. Then said the woman, whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And the king said unto her, be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, what form is he of? And she said, an old man cometh up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself, right? So as you can tell here, the woman herself brings up Samuel, right? And she herself is absolutely shocked. So this is something that she's not used to. She's probably another grifter, like we have a whole lot of these nowadays. She's just another one of those that is just simply probably pretending to do something. And then guess what happens? All of a sudden, she sees him come up out of, what does she say? God's ascending, right? Out of the earth. And he said unto her, what form is he of? So Saul is asking, what do you see? What does that person look like? She's completely in shock, right? And she says, why have you deceived me? So she understands right then and there that Samuel comes up, and the person in front of her, even though he's in disguise, is actually King Saul. King Saul understands that it is Samuel because he appears as an old man. That is, Samuel appears as an old man that is covered with a mantle. And then King Saul stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. Now, once again, remember, Samuel has died at this point, so apparently, I mean, again, this is divine intervention here. This is not something that happens, but in this case, it does happen. God literally sends Samuel to talk to King Saul, right? And let's see what their conversation is all about. So this is the following 5 verses here. When Samuel talks to King Saul, and Samuel said to Saul, why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me, and answered me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. Right? So as you can tell here, King Saul very much is, the word in the King James Version here is distressed, right? He is afraid. He doesn't know. He's got no guidance anymore because Samuel has been dead for a little bit. So God is not answering him. We'll find out here in a little bit why God does not answer him. So he is asking the woman to bring up Samuel from the dead so that, of course, in spirit, we're talking about in spirits here. It's not a physical form. So that he can give some sort of guidance to King Saul. Then said Samuel, wherefore then dost thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy? And the Lord had done to him as he spake by me, for the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David, because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executest his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore had the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines, right? So there's a whole lot going on here. So as you can tell, Samuel just simply tells him, why are you asking me, seeing that the Lord is departed from thee and has become thine enemy, right? The Lord has become thine enemy. And then he tells him, tomorrow you're going to die. That's what's going to happen. And the Lord is going to give the armies of Israel to the Philistines. You and your sons are going to be with me tomorrow. So that is a rather shocking statement, as you might imagine, and we're going to see King Saul's reaction here in a little bit. Now, I want to address something, and I want to address a couple of things really here. The first thing is that there is absolutely zero evidence in the Bible that the people who are dead know anything that is going on earth, period. So this is a divine intervention over here, right? And you can see some glimpses of what is in the afterlife, right? Obviously, from a Christian standpoint, our soul, that is S-O-U-L, just to make things clear here, our soul is immortal in a sense that after we die physically, our soul remains. As you can tell here, Samuel is resting in peace, right? So he's saying, why are you disquieting me? Why have you disquieted me, right? So Samuel himself is resting in peace. That's not guaranteed for all of us, but Samuel is resting in peace and he's being disquieted, right? So once again, there's no evidence that when people die, they have any idea, and I mean any idea of what's going on earth, right? They're in a completely different, let's just call it, use some quantum physics here terminology. They're in a different universe, right? They're completely out of here. So this is extraordinary. So this is divine intervention. Once again, this knowledge that Samuel possesses is not knowledge that everyone is going to possess once they die. I just want to make that clear. The other thing I want to discuss here is the fact that the Lord is departed from thee. So Samuel is telling King Saul that the Lord is departed from thee and is become thine enemy, right? So why and I have mostly talked about David here, obviously, but this book, the first book of Samuel, is actually a whole lot about King Saul, right? King Saul is definitely a cautionary tale, if you will. So why is King Saul a cautionary tale? King Saul is a cautionary tale because he truly believes in God, as you can tell. He is not someone who doesn't believe in God. He believes in God, but he does not obey specific commandments, right? As we're told over here. So what Samuel talks about here is Amalek. So he didn't execute the fierce anger of the Lord on this king. He's a savage king out there. These tribes, the Amalekites, they're no longer here. And he's bringing up one specific example. However, with King Saul, there are multiple transgressions. So at one point, he tried to sacrifice to God himself, which is a huge faux pas, if you will. That's a big no, right? There's only one king that is also a priest. One king that is also a priest, whom we celebrate Easter Sunday, right? Potentially excluding the mysterious king of Salem, and that is king of peace, right? Salem means peace, king of Salem, and that is Melchizedek, whom we encounter in the book of Genesis, and that is the person that Abraham gives a tenth to. Of course, that Melchizedek, he's both the priest and the king, and again, he's got no beginning, no end. That person is discussed in relative detail in the book of Hebrews, and we can very much equate him with Christ, and the book of Hebrews very much equates that person with Christ. So once again, the kings that sacrifice, the kings that pretend to be priests, there are no kings and there are no priests. They're just a fraud, essentially. That's one of the things that you definitely should not, if there's anything that you want to do to displease God, that would be it, right? So again, what is the actual issue with King Saul? So if you think about the 10 commandments as boxes, right? And I'm going to start with David just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. So obviously there is no man on earth that is without sin, excluding that one that we're celebrating on Sunday, right? There's no man on earth that is without sin. So whenever David starts checking those boxes, if you take the commandments as boxes, right, he starts from the bottom. Now, of course, you have to remember those 10 commandments, as they're laid out in the book of Exodus in chapter 20, they are placed in a specific order. I will argue that until the day I die. They're definitely placed in a specific order, right? So the first one is, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, right? That's the first one. And then the second one is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So King Saul's issue has always been pride. And we see example after example, especially with the kings in the following 4 books, right? And you have Samuel, the second book of Samuel, then you have Kings, Chronicles, right? So the following 4 or 5 books, they talk about the kings of Israel, and you can tell that their issue is always pride. Now, pride itself is not discussed in the 10 commandments, not because it doesn't belong there, but because it is the engine, if you will. It's the engine that drives all other transgressions, right? It's the engine that drives the breaking of all the other commandments. It is part of, if you will, it is the underlying part of that second commandment, which is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. King Saul has an extraordinary amount, he has acquired, let's put it that way, he has acquired an extraordinary amount of pride, and that pride is his downfall, just like it is the downfall of David, or not necessarily the downfall of David, is what drives David to commit sin, right? As I said before, he starts checking the boxes from the bottom, right? He covets, that's the last commandment, right? He covets the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and then he goes up the ladder, right? He commits murder, and then he lies as well, right? So, if you will, David starts checking the boxes from the bottom, whereas King Saul starts checking the boxes from the top, right? There is absolutely no doubt that King Saul believed in God. So the first commandment is not an issue here. Where it becomes an issue is the second commandment, and that is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That is, in essence, what pride is, right? Pride is you're worshiping yourself, if you will, right? That's what pride is. You could be worshiping other gods, but pride is worship of yourself, and that takes many forms, right? You believe in your own ability, looks, intellect, and so on and so on. You can tell that King Saul, from all the stories that we read about him, he's essentially full of himself, right? And then when he starts checking the boxes from the top, he goes all the way down to the bottom, right? Well, maybe not the last one, but you see the difference here between Saul and David. David starts from the bottom, Saul starts from the top. That's why David is commended for his faith, right? And King Saul is a cautionary tale because he starts from the top. Even Solomon doesn't start from the top. And speaking of Solomon, of course, you can, in the book of Proverbs, what does he say? Pride goes before destruction. So that is a very succinct way of saying exactly what this whole book is about. And I'm talking about the collection of books, right? I'm talking about the Bible itself. We're all guilty of pride, and some more than others, right? And as you can tell, what goes before destruction? Pride, right? So imagine destruction and then picture what goes before it. That's pride, right? So this is a recurring theme. It is one of the most common topics in the Bible, and you can tell, especially when you talk about the kings, how that pride that they have just really overwhelms them and leads them to make the decisions that they make. Very few question the existence of God, right? Very few break that commandment at the very top, but they start from the second one going down, right? So, the lady with the familiar spirits, right? The whisperer, the witch, she brings up Samuel from the dead. And then Samuel tells King Saul, tomorrow you and your sons and your army, they're all going to be dead, right? And you're going to be with me. So how does King Saul react to this? Then Saul fell straightway all along on the earth. So he just pancakes, right? Just face down without even buckling his knees. He just falls right on his face along the earth, right? That's his reaction. I mean, if you hear that you're going to die tomorrow, I would suspect your reaction may not be much different, right? Then Saul fell straightway all along the earth, on the earth, and was sore afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no bread all the day nor all the night. And the woman came unto Saul and saw that he was sore troubled, and said unto him, Behold, thine handmaid hath obeyed thy voice, and I have put my life in my hand, and have hearkened unto thy words which thou spakest unto me. Now therefore I pray thee, hearken thou also unto the voice of thine handmaid, and let me set a morsel of bread before thee, and eat, that thou mayest have strength when thou goest on thy way. Right? Just kind of stop here shortly. This is a rather terrifying event, right? Horrifying. And the reaction is rather, as you would expect, comical or not. So the witch, right? At that point, she starts calling herself thine handmaid. As you recall, Abigail did the same to David, right? That's a sign of respect towards someone who is of that type of caliber, right? We're talking about King Saul here. And then she offers him food, right? But he refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants together with the woman compelled him, and he hearkened unto their voice. So he arose from the earth and sat upon the bed, and the woman had a fat calf in the house, and she hasted and killed it, and took flour and kneaded it, and did bake unleavened bread thereof. And she brought it before Saul and before his servants, and they did eat. Then they rose up and went away that night. So as you can tell, what's going on here is that she gets some beef, right? That's his more or less last meal, I guess we can say. And then they go on their way after they eat. So just once again, happy